So, which countries are part of European civilization? It's a very controversial and hotly contested topic. Even the name European civilization can be somewhat controversial because people will also say Western civilization or white civilization, or in some cases, like Atlanticist civilization, although I think that's referring to a very specific type, like a subset of European civilization. Um, People even say things like Nordic or Aryan, but that often refers to more of a subgroup within European civilization. But nonetheless, it's widely agreed upon that there is such a thing as European civilization, or at least was, because some people will say, oh, we're living in post European civilization now because of multiculturalism. But regardless, in terms of which countries, let's say in the past few hundred years, have been part of European civilization, I would say there's several categories. There are the countries that are definitely part of European civilization. There's the countries that are probably part of European civilization. Um, there's the countries that are maybe, where it's kind of like very iffy. And then there's the countries that are probably not, but still have some commonalities with it. And then, of course, there's the countries that are definitely not. So, when going through one by one, I think the countries that are the most definitely part of European civilization would be basically the countries of northwestern Europe and some of the adjoining regions of Europe. So I would say Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, Netherlands, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Finland, Iceland. I would say I would put in UK and Ireland because there's some people who say that Anglo civilization is its own thing, but I would say it's a subset of European civilization, not a separate civilization. I would also definitely include, so I think I named all the countries of Western Europe, and I'm not going to name microstates because fuck them. But they're just implied to be included if I'm including everything surrounding the microstates. So I guess of the Eastern European countries, I definitely include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia. Let's see, Hungary, Slovenia, Croatia, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Macedonia, Montenegro. So I would say, okay, I would say those would be the ones that are definitely part of European civilization because they're within Europe and they're indisputably European. And then the ones that I would say are probably part, I would say part by almost any definition would be, well, Canada and the United States, because some people would say, oh, they're not European, they're North American, blah, blah, blah. But I'd say, nah, they're, by any definition, they're almost certainly part of European civilization. I would say Australia and New Zealand would be in this category. I would also include Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, because some people say like the more orthodox countries are semi-Asiatic or whatever, but I would say no, they're part of European civilization. The idea that Russia's Asiatic is a propaganda piece, just like it was with in World War One with calling Germans Huns or whatever. So I would say that would be in the category of probably, and by probably I mean like in my opinion, yes, they are, but I guess there's a tiny bit of doubt for certain reasons. So those would be the countries, yeah, I would say probably part of European civilization. Uh, the next category would be ones that are iffy, but I would lean toward yes. Like the second category was ones that I would say are definitely part of European civilization, but there's a tiny bit of doubt. And now this third category are ones that I would say, yes, I think they are part of European civilization, but I think they're ambiguous enough that it is, if somebody says they don't think they're part of European civilization, I'd say, okay, that's a legitimate perspective. I may disagree, but it's legitimate. So these ones are the ones where there's much more reasonable doubt. So in this category, I would include Bosnia, Albania, Armenia, Georgia, and Cyprus. I would include these as the ones I'd say are probably part of European civilization, but there is reasonable doubt. And I would say the reasonable doubt, Albania and Bosnia are definitely geographically part of Europe, but the fact that they're majority Muslim or a plurality Muslim in Bosnia's case does put them in a little bit of a gray area. However, I will keep in mind there are Christian minorities within these countries too, and I would say those groups fall more within the indisputably European category. Can you be both Muslim and part of European civilization? I'd say probably yes, but I will say it does call into question their inherent loyalty to some extent because Islam is a mostly non-European religion. That said, I've heard pagans argue, oh, Christianity is also a foreign religion from the Middle East. So the problem is if you discount Islam as inherently non-European, it does open the door for certain pagan arguments that discount Christianity as well. Now, obviously, you could say there's a huge distinction in that Europe has been majority Christian for centuries, whereas Islam has always been only a small part of Europe and larger at some times than others, like they did control Iberia for a while. But nonetheless, it's always been viewed as somewhat of a foreign presence in Europe. However, thinking about it like kind of like a lawyer, like from that perspective, it's like if you're going to define Islam as non-European, it does open the door for Christianity to also be defined in the same way. So that's one reason to be careful with that kind of logic, because they are both monotheistic religions from the Middle East, after all. But yeah, I put these in the category of probably European. With Cyprus, Armenia, and Georgia, these are countries that are majority Christian, but they're technically geographically not in Europe and technically kind of more in Asia, although they're still in a bit of a gray area. Now, that being said, obviously I included Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, despite not being geographically in Europe at all. But that's because New World countries aren't inherent. Like, there's nothing, like, it is widely recognized that New World countries outside of Europe can be part of European civilization. However, a country that is in Africa or Asia, on the other hand, is often seen as distinctly not part of European civilization because it's in Africa or Asia, because Africa and Asia are seen as the Orient or the East or the non-Western world. I don't know if people wouldn't call Africa Orient, or East, I don't think, but they call it Global South. Either way, it's seen as not part of European civilization for that reason. But those countries do occupy a fairly unique gray area in that regard. And if people want to view them as European, I'd say probably. If they're going to be lumped in with someone, they probably share ultimately more in common with Europeans than they do with the Middle East or with Asia in the broad sense of the word. So, yeah, those countries are iffy. But yeah, I'd say if they want to identify as European, I'm not going to stop them. The next category is countries that I'd say are really iffy and probably not part of European civilization, but could be argued as such. In this category, again, there's arguments that these could actually be above the previous category or below it, but they're very ambiguous, which would be Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and Chile. Now, I would say even within this, you could subdivide it even further, because I think with Argentina and Uruguay, there's the most argument, because I believe the majority of their population is of European descent. although I've seen varying statistics on that. They do speak a European language. They do practice Christianity mostly. The reason why I'm a bit more hesitant to include them as part of European civilization is because Latin America is, in its own way, its own civilization, like according to Huntington's civilizational model. So that makes me more hesitant to include them. That said, again, like the question who's part of European civilization is different from the question of who's white. Because, for instance, like there are white people living in El Salvador or Honduras. Like they're a minority, probably less than 5%, but they do exist. But are El Salvador or Honduras part of European civilization? I mean, no. Same with like Uzbekistan. There's a minority of Russians living there, or Kazakhstan. Although Kazakhstan gets a bit more ambiguous though, because, okay, I might have to put, okay. And I mean, it does raise the question, can a country be part of two civilizations at once? Maybe. So, I mean, I'm going to put Argentina and Uruguay. I'm not going to put them in the no category. I'm going to put them in the kind of like right on the fence category. I'm going to put Chile and Brazil in the probably not category. However, where it gets even trickier is there's some countries you can actually subdivide. Like Brazil would be one. Because southern Brazil is a lot more European descended than the other parts of the country. Furthermore, another country you could subdivide in this way is Kazakhstan, because the northern part of Kazakhstan is immediately adjacent to Russia and is majority Russian. At least parts of northern Kazakhstan, significant large portions of northern Kazakhstan are majority Russian. And as a side note, that's why the Kazakhs put their new planned capital city, which they've changed the name of so many fucking times. I don't even know what it's called now. Like it was called, I think, Astana, but then they called it Nur Sultan after Nur Sultan Nazarbayev, but I think they changed it back to, I don't even fucking know. They might have changed it back to Astana, or they might even call it something totally different now. I don't even know. But yeah, they put that there deliberately to like upset the Russian majority status of the region. Kind of a shitty move on their part, but I mean, I guess they saw it as justified. They see it as their land. I don't know who really has this historical moral claim to it, but whatever. It's beside the point. So yeah, I mean, you could put Kazakhstan, Brazil, and Chile in this category where it's like probably not, but in the case of Brazil and Kazakhstan, certain parts might be. In the case of Chile, to my understanding, Chile in general is majority kind of like castizo everywhere. I'm not sure if there's a majority white part of Chile. And if there is, it's probably not that large and not really big enough or geographically distinct enough to have its own sense of identity in that regard. But yeah, nonetheless, I mean, can castizos be part of European civilization? I don't know, maybe. But does Chile see itself more as part of European civilization or more as part of Latin American civilization? I would guess probably more Latin American, but I think it has some European traits. I mean, obviously, even Argentina and Uruguay would probably see themselves as Latin American first, European second. But, I mean, it is the question, can they be part of both at once? So, again, all these are in a gray area. And the next category would be countries that I would say are not part of European civilization, but have some European traits. I would say Turkey is in this category. I would say Turkey maybe could have been part of European civilization. I mean, under Ataturk, I think he wanted it to be. And I think there were arguments that it could have been at a certain time, but I think now it's just diverged too much, especially under Erdogan. It definitely varies from one part of the country to the other, but I was in Istanbul, and to be honest, with the amount of immigration it's seen, both from outside Turkey and within Turkey, like from eastern parts of Turkey, it definitely feels more like a Middle Eastern city than a European city at this point. That being said, there are European elements to Turkish culture, and I think in Istanbul and in Turkish Thrace and some of the other western parts of Turkey, it is more apparent. So I'd put Turkey in that category, like non-Western, but with some Western traits. I'd put Israel in that category, but again, they hate us. That's kind of the thing. It's like, well, that's the old trope with movies and TV and books and video games and everything. It's like that the protagonist and the antagonist have some things in common. They have some kind of shared heritage, despite ultimately not getting along with each other and being enemies. And I kind of feel like that's a little bit the case with Israel. So that's why I would view them that way. Like there are some aspects of Israeli society that do mirror European civilization in some ways. Like even some of the buildings, like the kind of like architecture they have for like the buildings that they've constructed since the foundation of Israel, some of it like looks not that different from like your town, like your post World War II townhouses or apartments that you can find in some parts of Southern Europe, like in Portugal, Spain, Italy, or Greece. So, I mean, there's a bit of similarities in that way. Um, and I'm sure in systems of government, things like that, although they're a lot more flagrantly genocidal, frankly, and shamelessly so, um, compared to European civilization today. And they get away with a lot more shit. And again, they do see us as different from them. And I return that perspective. I see them as different also. But nonetheless, there are some similarities. So I'd put them in that category. I'd also put South Africa in this category because it does have a substantial amount of influence from the white population, even if they are a minority, and they are a minority that are largely hated by the governing regime. But nonetheless, I think there are certain elements of they're sort of like a parallel people within South Africa, and there's still some informal de facto segregation even to this day, like culturally, socially, and geographically. So I think like there is that sense that they are a lingering element of European civilization within a majority non-European country. And I would say the same is the case for like Russians in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and other places in Central Asia where they still live. And also whites in Namibia as well. And I guess the very few that are still left in Zimbabwe, Botswana, Zambia. Angola's a little bit different because it was founded by the Portuguese, and I think there's a bit more mixing there and a bit. I feel like most of the whites in Angola are people who didn't stay there the whole time, but rather came from Portugal more recently after the War of Independence for economic reasons. So I don't know. Angola is a bit of a different story. But yeah, so I would put those in that category. I might also put the rest of Latin America in that category, like basically every other Latin American country that I didn't already mention. Because there's less of a strong sense of European civilization being an element of their identity, but there's still a little bit of that in there. But I would say they are predominantly a mestizo civilization. They are their own civilization, Latin American civilization. I could also add to this like various island societies that have small numbers of whites, like in the Caribbean, I believe Mauritius and some others in the Indian Ocean, and a few possessions of France, which I think are so separate from France that they should be mentioned separately, like New Caledonia, Réunion. But yeah, I would say those would include all of them. Maybe Azerbaijan because of the small Russian population there. I don't think Azerbaijan is like Turkey in that sense, though, because I think they're more distinctly non-Western. Like, they don't have the same history of Turkey with Ataturk implementing Europeanizing reforms. And I also think there are more Turks who are more like racially European compared to Azerbaijanis, who I would say are overwhelmingly like Middle Eastern descent, whereas Turks, like, they're mostly Middle Eastern descent, but I think there's a larger minority there who are predominantly by blood European compared to, say, Azerbaijan. So I'd put Turkey as a bit more ambiguous than Azerbaijan in that regard. Whereas Azerbaijan, I'd say, is pretty much a distinctively non-Western country, like an entirely non-European country, like not part of European civilization, but with a very tiny, increasingly small Russian minority. So, yeah, I think those are all the countries that even merit mentioning as either part of Western or European civilization or in association with it. Definitely not Japan. Some people include Japan. I don't. Japan is part of East Asian civilization. Frankly, calling Japan part of European civilization is a bit of an insult to them and their own heritage. They're not, just because they're civilized doesn't mean they're European. I don't get why some people add them in. I also don't think the rest of the Middle East and North Africa belong on this list, even if some of them may be to some extent genetically white. Like, you do get white-looking people like Bashar al-Assad popping up in that part of the world. Nonetheless, I think there's just too much cultural divergence to the point where it's like they don't really identify with European civilization at all. I would say less than Turkey does, frankly. Like, there's less of a recent historical tie in the last, let's say, 500 years to tie them specifically to European civilization. Like, I'd say they have diverged quite a bit to the point where it's like they're definitely not part of European civilization by any definition of the word. Like, countries like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, etc., Saudi Arabia, and all the others in the Arab Peninsula. I would say whatever link there was has been severed, and we're definitely different civilizations at this point. Obviously there were links in the times of the Romans and the Greeks, but that was a very long time ago, and even a little bit more recently, like before the spread of Islam, like there was a lot more direct interaction between all sides of the Mediterranean, where it was kind of part of the same civilization. But I would say at this point it's diverged so much, they're definitely a different civilization from us. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that. So let me know what you guys think.